Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson, for this, a quick episode, which is meant to be a supplement to the 100th episode, which went live slightly earlier this evening. When the 100th episode went live, I'd muted one of the tracks in the original, and that means that there's 3 minutes of silence at the start of the 100th episode, for which I apologise. Because this podcast is run on a shoestring, to pull down that episode, add the 3 minutes back in, and then reload the whole episode would use up over half of my data for the podcast plan for the month, and so I'm just going to record a supplemental now. In Heirs to Merlin, it states that the corruption of House Totalis began with a fallen covenant in Cornwall. I need to address that as part of the Cornish work I'm doing to put together a gazette here, and my first question was that, given demons lack any virtue, and thus cannot plan, how can they beat the upper cadre of House Totalis, who are some of the sneakiest people in mythic Europe? The usual answer is hubris, but hubris still requires some sort of trap for them to fall into. My counter is that, in the new edition, demons find a way around their lack of patience and other virtues by using diabolists who can use virtues to perform vices. In 2nd edition, there were things called infernal saints, who were paragons of individual sins that were given powers by the infernal to tempt others to try and take their places. So Satan was playing Unknown Armies before it was cool. Anyway, dead diabolists retain the ability to plan, so the other side of the corruption in the Cornish material is going to be one of these infernal saints. The poem recorded for episode 100, Dolores Notre Dame de Seps Dolores, by Algernon Charles Swinburne, is a prayer and a mystery initiation script for the cult of the Infernal Saint of Sorrow. I know that the D&D Planescape people have used a Lady of Pain in their setting as well, but I'm not familiar with their work, so any resemblance is due to the fact that we're sharing source material. Her statistics are available from the website which accompanies this podcast. To delve into my reworking of the Infernal Saints, an Infernal Saint is technically a dead human being. The human body is given an extended life, if it can be called that, by a possessing demonic force. This reward is given by the Lords of Hell to humans who exemplify a vice. This encourages other diabolists to attempt to steal the role by performing acts of increasing evil. In Dolores' case, the human and the demon have been paired for so long that they're effectively a single mind, albeit one divided by an internal narrative. Infernal saints have weaknesses demons do not have. They are, in many senses, human. This means they can be permanently laid to rest. Sadly, the thing which dwells inside them, granting them power, usually finds a new host or is replaced by another demon that takes up the mantle of the possessing force. They can also technically be redeemed. It's almost unheard of, but God cheats sometimes. The one power infernal saints have, which demons generally do not, is that they are capable of using virtues to perform vices like other diabolists. They can plan because they have patience and foresight, which demons lack. The competition to remain the infernal saint is a sort of filter. Player characters are unlikely to meet an incompetent or indecisive infernal saint because they don't survive long. This makes them formidable adversaries. Dolores interests us because she masterminded the corruption of House Totalis. The Sibyl worship of the necromantic cult from which the house rose and the chthonic fixations that they have led to an attempt to call up the embodiment of death herself. In this, it seems they were attempting to call the opposite of the sort of elemental creator spirits which they call the Titanoi. They sought the embodiment of the natural process of dying rather than a fairy goddess, but they refer to that creature as Proserpine because that's how she was described in the texts of the Archnecromantrix, Gwrna the Fetid. The creature summoned seemed to be Proserpine. Chthonic rituals are always risky, though. Dolores gradually corrupted first the leaders, then the magical symbolism of the house. Perhaps Sagilla, the Prima, was tricked into believing that she had discovered Dolores' identity accidentally. Perhaps she was tricked into thinking she could become the Saint of Sorrow. Perhaps, at the final confrontation, Dolores revealed that she, unlike so many creatures from hell, could lay snares that stoked the pride of her rival, then draw in her prey implacably. In the end, Sagilla bowed and died and did not regret her death. Death is a form of worship for the followers of the Lady of Pain. Suicide at her altar grants them, they believe, a place in her infernal retinue. Who can say if this is true? Theologically, it is bad. No human can become a demon. But infernal ghosts exist, and with sufficient dark power poured through them, who is to suggest their limit? Dolores' statistics are given on the blog that accompanies this podcast. She's essentially what happens if you take a Fury and a False God, mash them together, and then attach a really large battery. This isn't mentioned in the podcast post, but I can't help thinking that Dolores also explains the Shadow Flambeau. If you remember, back in 2nd edition when the Iberian book came out, it had editorial problems. Demons were added where they were not needed, and one of the characters was particularly poorly received because she had been invaded by a demon of lust, and her skill set included the crafting of intimate, painful toys. It seemed like a cheap joke that weakened the rest of the setting. But through the lens of a cult of an infernal saint of sorrow that has already caused one house to fall into corruption, the fact that at the centre of the next great corruption of a house from the Order, there is this character which, despite how she was written, seems to share some affinity for the Saint of Sorrow. I think that's an interesting connection that should be explored further. And now I commend to you episode 100. Skip the blank 3 minutes at the beginning, and thank you to all of the podcast's followers. I really, truly wouldn't be at the 100th episode without your support and assistance. I'd also like to thank all of you who at this point are continuing the metagame that makes new material for Ars Magica possible. For all of you who blog and share on social media, for all of you who participate in the forums, to our older, if somewhat less prolific sister, the Arcane Connection podcast, welcome back. To those of you who edit the 3 fanzines, to those of you who write and subscribe for those fanzines, our community is one of the most welcoming and, for its size, prolific in the role-playing industry. Thank you so much, and see you next week.